Hello, my name is Rebecca Chung. I'm the director of 21 CSLA State Center, and today we present to you Research Practice Webinar 11. Does locked up mean locked out of higher education? Before we begin today's webinar, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other Verona Band descendants. Every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community inclusion and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also that we recognize the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. As a beginning recognition of this, members of the Berkeley School of Education contribute to the Shumi Land Tax, a voluntary financial contribution that non-Indigenous people living on traditional Chochenyo and Ohlone territory make to support the critical work of the Sogorea Te Land Trust. We understand that our ways of recognizing how we and the university have benefited, as reflected in the recent opening of the world's first Ohlone restaurant at UC Berkeley's Hearst Museum of Anthropology, must be increased. If you too have benefited or continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land, we encourage you to do the same. If you do not live in Berkeley, we encourage you to visit nativeland.ca to learn more about the land you occupy and find meaningful ways to support the Indigenous stewards of that land. And welcome again to 21 CSLA's webinar number 11, Does locked up mean locked out of higher education? The 21st Century School Leadership Academy is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teachers, site, and district to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Leaders for Equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systematically marginalized and historically underserved, so that they can thrive. 21 CSLA is sponsored by the California Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. And now I'll turn over the microphone to the chair of 21 CSLA, Professor Jabari Mahiri.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. I'm actually the chair of the leadership board of 21 CSLA, just to have everything specific in relationship to the title under my name. And welcome, everyone. We really appreciate your participation in this 11th webinar of 21 CSLA. And it's our exciting opportunity to host Dr. Tolani Britton, who before becoming a professor at UC Berkeley and graduating from Harvard Graduate School of Education, was a high school English teacher in math in New York City. Professor Britton's quasi-experimental methods explore the impact of policies on students' transition from secondary school to higher education, as well as access and retention in higher education. I really encourage you all to go to the website, the Berkeley School of Education website, for a fuller listing of her amazing accomplishments, which include many prestigious awards like the Spencer Postdoc Fellowship and the AERA, the American Educational Research Association Early Career Award, and also to get a peek at some of her additional publications in addition to the one that focuses on our topic for today. So with that, I also want to introduce our other two participants in today's webinar. Dr. David Diehl, Coordinator of Student Support Services at Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, and Dr. Jennifer Izant Gonzales, Director of Alternative Education at Santa Cruz County Office of Education. You got to see on the earlier slide the agenda for today, which is going to be having a presentation by Professor Tolani Britton. And then after that research presentation, we will have an opportunity for those practitioner perspectives to come to the forefront for about 5 minutes or so for each perspective. And then we'll open it up to discussion and Q&A from you all as the participants before closing at 4:30. So with that, without any more ado, I want to turn the, I do want to also mention that there's a background channel conversation going on Kialo. And this means that you can click onto this website and continue to have dialogue with all of the participants on our webinar today. We're right at 50 now, and we anticipate there will be even more, so that more opportunities for communication can occur by going to the website that you see below on this slide. And with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Tolani Britton.
Thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to share this pretty new research with the 21 CSLA community. I consider it a privilege to be in conversation here. Because I am a former high school math teacher and I like things to be organized, even though we've seen an agenda, I'll give you an outline now to what I'm going to talk about briefly before entering a conversation with David and Jennifer. The context here is really the increase in access to college courses, and in particular, the increase in access to college courses for currently incarcerated students, demographic information on college students who are currently taking courses in California prisons to get a sense of who's currently has access to courses, the research questions for the study, data, and I promise to be really brief around the methods. I've been encouraged to be brief and I will. Results, as well as what are some of the potential implications of this really early work. So the context for this study is really relatively recent legislation that expanded access to, in particular, college courses offered in the California state prisons. And in 2014, there was Senate Bill 1391. Part of what this particular bill did is it encouraged universities and community colleges really to offer courses. And what it did is it compensated those community colleges the same amount for students who are taking courses while incarcerated, and the amount that was provided for students who are taking courses on campus. So it incentivized these community colleges to offer additional courses in the California state prison system. The other piece of it, and I think this was a really important piece as well, was really making sure that the courses that were being offered to students who are incarcerated would be courses that would lead to degrees or certificate, leading to better workforce skills and or transfer. So not simply an expansion of courses, but it also expanded was very clear about the sorts of courses that should be offered to incarcerated college students. And then in 2016, the Public Safety and Rehabilitation Act of 2016 provided sentence credits for education. As of May 2019, persons who are incarcerated could earn 180 days of credit for certain types of completion, for example, of high school or high school equivalency degrees. One of the reasons that this study was really feasible in some ways is not simply the geography of the state of California, but the locations of the community colleges, the California State University campuses, and their location near a number of many of the state prisons here in California. If you look at, so our orange boxes are the state prisons, the blue dots are the CSUs, while the turquoise dots are the CSUs, and the darker blue dots are the California community colleges. And you'll see, with a few exceptions, particularly in the north of the state, many of the California state prisons are located very close to campuses of colleges in the system. Given this, not only this change in legislation, but also some of the geographic factors that we saw on the last slide, there was really a pretty significant increase in access to in-prison college programs. And so you see that we grew in 2014, there was one prison that had a face-to-face college program, and that was actually in San Quentin. It was a privately run program. There was one CSU Project Rebound. So, and then a number of on-campus programs for people who had been formerly incarcerated. And we see the expansion just in those 3 years after the passage of the legislation to 34 prisons out of the 35 state prisons having face-to-face college courses. So not simply correspondence courses, but actually courses. And as I said before, this is absolutely related both to the geographic locations of the California community colleges and the CSUs, and also some of the legislation and clear desire to increase access to persons who are incarcerated. So in thinking about who has access to courses, to college courses while they're incarcerated, it's important to sort of understand who was in prison in California in the years included in the study, which are 2018 to 2021. And we see that we have approximately 130,000 persons, and fewer than 5% are women in the year 2018. The other thing to note is when thinking about how well represented populations are with respect to being incarcerated in California as compared to their fraction of the population, we see, and this is not new to most of us, that there's a relatively high rate of incarceration for Black persons and for Latinx persons in California when compared to their share of the population. And thinking sort of more broadly about some of the courses that are being offered and the education that's being offered, we have 22 California community colleges participating, and this is based on 2018 data. There's absolutely been expansion since then, but because this study starts in 2018, I'm going to anchor on that data. 34 out of the 35 state prisons and approximately 6,000 students in 2018. And there were certainly more students when looking across students who were enrolled both in face-to-face courses and correspondence courses, though it's really important to note that when we're thinking about these courses, that particularly the 34 in the 34 state prisons, that many of these courses are in-person courses. So here, I'm just going to pause for a moment and let you take a look at who, if we're thinking about who are the persons who, while incarcerated, had access to courses and were actually taking courses. So this is not really just thinking about access, but people who are actually enrolled in a course. This breaks down the population both by sort of the incarcerated population, but then looking at student enrollment by race, ethnicity, as well as age. So I'll just give you a moment to take a look at that. As well as to note that when we're thinking about across sort of races and ethnicities, when we're looking at the persons who are enrolled in courses, we see that in terms of age, at least, persons who are between 18 and 34 across most sort of races and ethnicities comprise close to half of the students, but there's also representation among persons older than 35 as well. And one of the reasons we're thinking about what are not only sort of race and ethnicity, but also race, ethnicity, and then age, is thinking about for persons who have access to courses while incarcerated, how likely are they to re-enroll once they are no longer incarcerated? And this brings me to the two research questions from this sort of larger study that I'll be covering today. The first is, what are the demographic characteristics of students who re-enroll in college following their release from prison in California? And then the second question, so that's really just trying to understand who re-enrolls in college once they're released from California state prisons after having taken courses. And then the second research question, for persons in California who took community college courses while incarcerated, what is the likelihood of enrollment in a community college after leaving a state prison? And so this is really thinking if for persons who received access and took courses, not simply received access, but took courses while incarcerated, how likely are they to then be able to re-enroll in a community college after their release. And we know that access to courses for persons who are incarcerated is really important. And part of that is really changing life outcomes. And that looks like both having access to the courses, the knowledge in the courses, but also credentials. So in order to carry this out, I used administrative records from the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. And this is the census of all California community college students enrolled from 2018 to 2021 across the state campuses. Some of the characteristics or variables that I used were things like student demographics, units enrolled and earned, course type, grades, and campus characteristics. And including in this particular work, students who enrolled in face-to-face and hybrid college credit courses, the hybrid courses meaning they had some face-to-face instruction. I will really pause briefly here for those who get excited about regression analysis. Essentially, my model, I heard laughter. Essentially, the model is really thinking about whether or not there was a student who was incarcerated and what was their likelihood of re-enrolling in college for a given student in a given college in a given semester. And some of the covariates or things that I sort of quote unquote control for are age, race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as college fixed effects. And college fixed effects essentially really think about what are characteristics of the community colleges and how might those be related to enrollment, and how do I explain or absorb some of the variation from the very college specific characteristics. And now for some, happily, we can move on. In terms of thinking about both my sample and my comparison groups, I'm looking at students who enrolled in fall 2018 and stopped out for at least one fall or spring semester before spring 2021, so over this 3-year period. And I use 2 different comparison groups, and I'll talk a little bit more about this if there are questions, but the first comparison group is really students who do not identify as formerly incarcerated and took at least one course and subsequently left college for at least a semester. And so the thought here is thinking about re-enrollment for formerly incarcerated students. It's saying when compared to other students who may have had an interrupted pattern of enrollment, what is the likelihood of re-enrolling? And the second, but I think, it would be both unfair and naive to assume that some of the challenges of interrupted sort of enrollment in college are the same across students who have been formerly incarcerated and students who have not been formerly incarcerated. And so the second comparison group is really looking at students who self-identify as students with conviction histories who did not take courses while they were in prison. So it's comparing students who were able to take courses while in prison with students who are also formerly incarcerated, but did not necessarily have access or did not take courses while imprisoned. So for the first question, which is really just trying to understand who re-enrolls in college after having access while incarcerated, the data demonstrates that about 17% of students who took courses while incarcerated subsequently enrolled in California community colleges as a non-incarcerated student. So on the one hand, many people might say that number seems sort of low, right? If we're thinking about students who had access or rather took college courses, but then re-enrolled. On the other hand, it's really important to hold some of the challenges that formerly incarcerated students face with respect to housing, basic needs, food, finding sort of employment. And so the 17% would absolutely suggest, and so this is really just sort of the demographic statistics looking at that, but we'll also look at some analysis where we do some comparisons. But I think it's in some ways actually encouraging to see that 17% of students who had access to these courses then re-enroll. When thinking about student characteristics, about 76% are men and 22% are women. Part of what's interesting with this particular finding is really that about 5% of persons who are both incarcerated and college students or incarcerated college students are women. And so we actually see that women are sort of overrepresented when we're looking at the persons who are re-enrolling in college after having taken courses while incarcerated. And then in terms of the demographics, with race and ethnicity, about 3% are identify as Asian American, 18% as Black, 42% Latinx, 23% white, and about 7% unknown race. Part of, in some ways, part of this work is really trying to understand both what are sort of the demographic characteristics, not only of those who are currently incarcerated community college students, and there's been some really good work done here by the Chancellor's Office, but also trying to understand, thinking about formerly incarcerated students who re-enrolled in California community colleges, and seeing whether we see relatively similar fractions of students, particularly by race and ethnicity, who were enrolled when they were incarcerated, and then once they're no longer incarcerated. And so some of the things to note here are that, for example, while Latinx students are we're almost half of sort of currently incarcerated California community college students, there are slightly smaller share of the persons who re-enroll in California community colleges once they are released. And similarly for white students who took courses while incarcerated, a slightly larger fraction seem to enroll in community college once they're released. In thinking about the second research question, which is really thinking about controlling for some of the factors, some of the demographic factors, the descriptive demographic factors we just talked about, what's the likelihood of re-enrollment? And here's also a place where I think there's some really great news here, which is what this is essentially showing you is that there's for students who are formerly incarcerated, they're actually more likely than their peers who are not incarcerated to take a semester off, but then re-enroll. So once again, this is really just suggesting and demonstrating in some ways the ways in the dedication and the ways in which students who are formerly incarcerated are more likely to return to California community colleges or re-enroll in California community colleges in pursuit clearly of certificates and degrees. And then the second piece, right? So this is just the slide that we just showed was really thinking about comparing students who are formerly incarcerated to all students. This particular slide is thinking about, okay, so we have two groups of students, both who are formerly incarcerated. One group had access to courses while in prison and took courses while in prison, the other didn't. And here we see that there's actually, they're actually slightly less likely, though it's marginally significant. So when it's marginally significant, the question is, how much do we trust those findings? And part of my work is actually still sort of trying to tease this apart. You see that the N equals 592. So it's a much smaller sample of students who are formerly incarcerated and re-enrolled. But it does seem to suggest that students who took courses while they were incarcerated and were slightly less likely to re-enroll when compared to students who were also formerly incarcerated but didn't take courses while they were incarcerated. And we'll talk, I'll briefly talk a little bit about why I think that might have been the case. Before I sort of talk about why I think these are, what are some potential explanations for these very, very, very preliminary findings, it's important to note that one of the limitations of this study is I have limited information about who is being released from prison. And in some ways, one is about data access, but the other is also by construction. So I can see when students are taking courses and when they're not taking courses, but I'm not working with the data from the Department of Corrections. What we do know based on sort of current release data is that about, close to half of persons are released after serving approximately 2 years. But they're also, close to 30% who are serving life and life without parole sentences. And so it could be that some of the students that I'm capturing who are taking courses while incarcerated would sort of never show up in my sample of students who would re-enroll once they were released. So what are sort of the potential implications, and I say potential because this is, so early in the work. One is that there's preliminary evidence that the community college courses offered in prison increase college access for incarcerated persons. The other thing to think about is, as I said, that 17% of persons who re-enroll, on the one hand, given that not everyone is released from prison who takes courses, is a clear demonstration that the access is leading to persistence. It's also really important to think about what are some of the barriers faced by students who took courses while incarcerated, and the ways that, and it could be sort of the timing of release or other factors. But it's clear that there are some factors that potentially differ from barriers that are faced sort of more generally by formerly incarcerated students. And then the other piece is, as I said, this work is really just thinking about students being re-enrolled, but being enrolled or re-enrolled in college is just really one very small piece of the puzzle. Part of the reason we want students to enroll is to earn certificates, degrees, and improve their life outcomes with respect to employment, to their likelihood of being unemployed. We know that there are, relationships between college degrees and health outcomes, maternal well-being, infant mortality. So there are a whole sort of range of life outcomes that we really care about when thinking about not just do we get to college, but are we able to earn degrees and certificates. The other, one of the reasons, so as part of this work, there's one of the reasons I'm so excited is that there's so much going on in this space. And in very, very recently, there was a bill authorizing the California community colleges to essentially establish a grant program in some of the community colleges to provide funds to support both formerly and currently incarcerated students. And so when thinking about both access and barriers, we know that funding matters. And so I think part of the work going forward will absolutely be trying to build on some of this work and understand what is the impact of this additional funding. As I mentioned before, it's not simply do persons have access to community college courses, but really thinking about persistence, right? What does it look like to not just get to, but through school, the majors? We know that there are some courses that are much harder to offer to, for example, currently incarcerated students. And so what is the impact of that on the majors that are chosen? And then really thinking about completion. As part of my work, I try not simply to think about what's the role of individual students, but really thinking about the structures in which students are learning and being. And so also thinking about what are campuses that are successfully not only enrolling, but graduating, particularly formerly incarcerated students, and what are some of the practices at those campuses that really enable student success. Special thanks to 21 CSLA, and then Betsy Friedman and McCall Kurlander, who have helped me with data access and analysis, and then the National Academy Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship for the funding to do this work. And I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Britton. This is a good jumping off point to get into some of the considerations that you've raised around this important issue. And I want to turn it over immediately to our two respondents who are, practitioners and deeply involved in work with getting students to, from high school to college. So let's go ahead and begin with Dr. David Diehl.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Britton. College for any student is a self-esteem builder when they enter college. And certainly for our students who have been incarcerated or previously incarcerated, just being able to call themselves a college student when oftentimes their previous academic experience hasn't been the best and it's been interrupted oftentimes, this can really shift their mindset around their own self-worth. So I feel that that's certainly something to recognize, but also for us to recognize that many of the students didn't have positive experiences oftentimes in their early education, from kindergarten through 12th grade. And many of our young adults who are in the state prison system, in the adult state prison system, have previously been incarcerated as juveniles. So their education was often interrupted. As one student once told me, that the criminal justice system is often quick to point out what they don't do right, but never recognizes what they've done well. And so aside from just the education that they're getting, how do we how do we ensure that they're supported and really reframing their perception of themselves as students moving forward? Because within the penal system and in being incarcerated, they're in one environment, and going outside creates a whole nother set of barriers, and some that are obvious and some that are not so obvious, because leaving incarceration can be an extremely traumatic experience. So just trying to navigate that is something that I think we need to recognize early, and also recognize when our students are much younger, how we're engaging them. So I think that's certainly something to be considered.
Dr. Gonzales, can you add to our discussion?
Yes, thank you so much, and good afternoon. I'm very, very thrilled to be a part of this conversation. So the Santa Cruz County Office of Education has a very small school program at our local juvenile hall facility. And over the past year, we call our program very small but mighty. We've really focused on the opportunity that we have for a small number of students who are in our program for quite a bit of time. And what we didn't have in place was the opportunities so much for them to be dually enrolled. And so over the past year, I want to really give a lot of gratitude to our teachers and our probation partners and our college and career coordinator who worked with our students together to be able to introduce them to the opportunity of college while they were with us. Because the college system is difficult to navigate. It's hard for anyone. It's hard for myself. There are applications you have to do every semester. There's orientations, there are placement and planning workshops. There's a whole bunch of information you have to get to be able to even get in the door. And so there's, for students who are incarcerated as youth who are in our programs, it was this great experiment that we're continuing to build and grow upon, because as Dave mentioned, you notice when students are engaging in college courses, how things change in their perception of themselves as scholars, and how there's some excitement, and it's also spreads amongst the small group of students. And recently we had a student who graduated who is moving on to a different facility that's near near a different CSU, and his graduation was very powerful, and he had a plan that he was going to that. He had researched that CSU that is near where he was going to go, and very determined, and spoke of how that was his next steps with so much confidence. And I just think that there's so much we can do while we have students with us, that, as Dr. Tolani said, like the research shows that students, when they have that opportunity while incarcerated, they're more apt to rejoin the higher education system. And that's such an amazing benefit in life for yourself, for your family, for our communities. We also learned a lot of lessons along the way too. So that's what happens when you build the plane while you're flying it.
Excellent. Can you just give us one quick example of a lesson that you learned along the way that is helping you rethink about these critical issues, Dr. Gonzales?
Yes, not to never underestimate how just crucial it is for the basic steps of being successful in college. So, and also the many layers and different entities that are in institutional facilities. So you have different staff, different shift changes, different people who come on after a certain amount of time, and so communicating with everyone about this, what you're doing is crucial, because if a student is taking a college course and then someone that they're working with changes, it can cause some friction. So communication is one. And then we really focused on, there is a college course at our local community college that focuses on the fundamentals of being a successful college student. It's an introductory course, and you can't get to the next level courses and career pathways and higher education if you do not understand how to access the learning management system that the college uses. You don't if you don't understand how to access the online curriculum. So there is a course that we discovered as a team, and I want to give a lot of thanks to our college and career coordinator and our educators who researched. This is a first introductory course where students can get to know the local school. So when they are released and have the next opportunity to get in a college course, they understand how to navigate the system. So I would say some of the lessons: communication with all the different entities that you work with, and that taking that introductory course was instrumental for college success for our students.
Well, it sounds like some really interesting practices are being instituted to facilitate these students being successful. Some of our questions are starting to come in, and they address that very consideration of what is the sort of indicators of success in these movements from incarceration to higher education. Thank you, Dr. Gonzales and Dr. Diehl. We want to ask the first question and have Dr. Britton take the first response to it, and then, of course, either of our participants or both can add into that discussion as we go. One of the questions that's coming from our participants is, have there been studies examining if continuing education, either while incarcerated or after returning to the community, serves as a protective factor regarding recidivism and successful reentry? Dr. Britton?
Yeah, happy to take that one. And yes, there are numerous studies that demonstrate that taking courses writ large, not simply college courses, but it could be, sort of high school equivalency, the GED, or other kinds of educational courses, but particularly college courses, leads to a large decrease in the likelihood of recidivism. And I think that's one, it's an important consideration. And I want to both have conversations about recidivism and the quality of life for persons who are formerly incarcerated. I think one of the things that I heard both of my colleagues just say was thinking about how people perceive themselves and the ways in which this education not only changes their outcomes, but it changes the outcomes, of their family and their community. And so both holding the importance of reductions in recidivism, but also in the sort of very potentially positive ways it can change lives.
Any other considerations that Dr. Diehl or Dr. Gonzales want to share on that question?
I think, well, I have a short story. I think it's a little heartwarming. I was a teacher in the Monterey County Office of Education in the court schools for incarcerated students. And a few weeks ago, I was at an event, saw a young man that looked familiar, had to go up to him and just, I said, "Gosh, do I know you?" And he said, yes, Mr. Diehl. It's Omar. And he was a student that had been incarcerated for a few years. He got out and he says, I'm getting my master's degree in school psychology. So I think there's certainly, that was a long road for that young man. And he clearly was a bright student, but knowing many of the barriers, he had to have many supports along the way. And I think to recognize our students are super resilient. They have many talents, but again, to get to that point, supports are essential along the way. And he had indicated as that to me, that without certain supports, he wouldn't have gotten there. So I think we have to make sure that we're giving supports and the right supports.
That's an excellent narrative, an excellent story of affirmation. One of the things that I was thinking about with Dr. Britton's study is it begs for the qualitative research to follow some of these, students into their lives in school and beyond. Dr. Gonzales, anything to add to our first question on successful reentry and protective factors that facilitate recidivism? That facilitate, them being able to stay in school and not return to prison.
I just echo what you both, I would just echo what you both said about, well, versus wonderful story and just needing more data, you know, both narrative data and just tracking how, you know, like we were just talking about, Dr. Britton, in your presentation, is the limitations of the data that you have access to, and to, it would be wonderful to be able to track further our students and their futures, to be able to make more informed decisions.
So let's move on to another question that our participants have posed, directed at your work, directed towards your work, Dr. Britton. Were you able to examine, or do you have thoughts about how prior educational achievement may contribute to enrolling in classes during incarceration as well as after reentry?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of prior academic achievement, with reentry, that we can control for courses that you took and how well you did in courses. In terms of thinking about for students who, I think absolutely, like the point is really well taken, that it's a non-random sample of persons who are taking courses while incarcerated. Likely, you know, students, you know, who are like, okay, yeah, I want to take college courses. And I think that there's a waiting list for these courses. So that would suggest to me that it's not simply a relatively small sample of students who want to take these courses, but a relatively large body of students. And I think, you know, as Dr. Gonzales said, there's this whole process around actually applying for college. And I do wonder if there's something about having these colleges offered in prisons that actually allows students to have the experience in ways that might even have been more difficult had they had to do this outside of that structure. So I think on the one hand, yes, it is likely that students who might have had more positive experiences might be more likely to be interested in taking college courses while incarcerated. But somehow I think that at least once again, I think, you know, Dr. Mahiri and Dr. Diehl, this talks to some of the narrative work that you were both referencing. It is also the case that for students who have had negative experiences, but then have this positive experience with higher education, and then tell other people about these positive experiences, it opens the door, I think, for many people to see themselves and to be college students. And I'll stop there.
Well, Dr. Gonzales and Dr. Diehl, you all are on the ground with this work and closer to some of the experiences that students may have, and you may know a little bit more about their educational background and achievements in relationship to how that contributes to their enrolling in these classes. Can you say any more about that from your own work in your various contexts?
I would give it up to our educational team and support team in the classroom and at our school, because it's expensive and it takes a lot of people, but that's what makes it work. Our college and career coordinator working one-on-one with the student, our teacher helping support the student throughout their courses, and the probation team being understanding of you know, maybe there's technology issues or this or that. It takes a lot, but that positive experience definitely leads, is infectious in a good way with the group, and I think is an amazing benefit to being able to have this support system and then to move on. And I also wanted to say that students prior academic success prior to coming to our program at our juvenile hall, we have students, the small amount of students who are taking college courses were not generally considered successful in some of the courses they were, or in school before in general. And it is still definitely possible with that tremendous amount of support to experience success in college. And that's phenomenal. and also want to give it up, of course, to our students, because they're the ones that are wanting to engage in this. It's not forced upon them, and they're the ones putting in the hard work.
Dr. Diehl.
Yeah, thank you. My experience has been, and with the students that I've encountered and through my research, is that early disengagement in our elementary schools was often a common theme for many of the young men and women. And oftentimes there was the literacy acquisition was not there, which then made school not so fun early on, and it became difficult. That kind of led to other things that made the educational experience not enjoyable. On top of that, oftentimes undetected learning differences and disruptions in their own environment that inhibited their ability to access education. Then in going into the juvenile justice system, as they become adolescents, oftentimes the students are incarcerated for 3 or 4 weeks. They're released, they get put back in an alternative educational environment, and there's many interruptions along the way through those very important teen years. Again, I think we have to be very mindful that their educational experience has not been so positive, and there's been many interruptions within that experience as they get into their adolescent years. So that are things that we need to navigate and help them navigate their coursework, and keeping many of those issues in mind as we enroll them in college courses. And again, I keep sound like a little bit like a broken record, but the support network, the support that they need might be entirely different than supports that students coming from a traditional high school might need.
I want to ask a question that didn't come from our participants, unless I consider myself one of the participants. And that question has to do with the fact that in our fall retreat, 21 CSLA here in Berkeley, we had the opportunity to go to the Berkeley Art Museum, and they have an amazing exhibit on doing time. And we had a learning walk, and we had a lot of intensive discussions about reconceptualizing, considerations of systems of crime and punishment. So this has taken us a little bit further, and it'll be our last question that we'll talk about a little bit. But you guys are right on the ground researching these considerations and working with these students. What can you say about what we need to do as a society to sort of reconceptualize considerations of our, criminal justice systems in relationship to how they may inequitably penalize some of the very participants that you are often working with in this prison to higher education connection that we've been discussing today. And I'll ask you to start with that, Dr. Britton. I know you think about this a lot.
I was actually hoping you would start with me. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'm going to reflect it back to make sure I understand what you're asking. And that in some ways, the question is, how should the system itself be reconceptualized or reformed? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a Monday, not a Wednesday kind of question. So I think that when we think about what works, there was an earlier question around recidivism and whether, sort of receiving access to education, particularly post-secondary education, college education, reduce recidivism, and it does. And so if we know that what actually works in changing behavior and creating opportunities is education and more equitable education and support for students who need additional support, then the question is, how are we thinking about how we invest in systems of education? Dr. Diehl's point is really well taken, that many students feel pushed out in elementary school. And so how are we investing in students in the early years, in preschool, in the elementary years, in middle school? What are the ways in which we are recognizing that the ways in which schools have a really, really unique role in not just educating students, but sort of either denying access or increasing access to opportunity. And then as a society, how do we invest in schools, particularly in schools for our most marginalized students, if what we're actually trying to do is change systems of correction, or correction being word used loosely. So I'll pass it.
Anyone can take it up of our participants, our practitioners.
Yeah, I think there is a push out. It starts early on, and we need greater awareness for our teachers. Oftentimes, students that live in marginalized communities attend schools with teachers that are new to the teaching profession. These students need the best and most experienced teachers, but oftentimes don't get those teachers. And so increasing awareness around the barriers and the challenges that those students have, so they do feel included. But one thing I wanted to point out too is that even when students finally, when they do leave incarceration, and this is on the other end, there's many restrictions and conditions that are put on these students that become huge barriers that the average college student wouldn't have, because they're now placed on probation. They have restrictions on what time they can come home, who they can hang out with, whether or not they can go out and have a beer, and many things that the average college student can enjoy become additional barriers for our students. So these same barriers that they experience kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, there becomes a new set of barriers that we place on them. And are these barriers helpful, or are they detrimental? And I think we need to look at these barriers that we create where we think that we're doing some good, but maybe we're doing more harm.
Wow. Dr. Gonzales, can you give us a point or two, and then we'll let Dr. Britton have the last word.
Oh, we could go on for days and days about this. The first, I appreciate the perspectives that have already been brought up. And I just keep thinking of, it's almost just a paradigm shift in how we double down on support and love, actions that really care about our students early on. I think we're going to study this time period right now after the pandemic with how schools are dealing with student behaviors, that we'll see how are we acting right now to support our students that might cause the most work in our classrooms and be pushed out. How are we thinking differently in this current moment to support our students before they're kind of pushed towards the juvenile justice system? And the restriction comments you made, Dr. Diehl, was, reminded me also of our forever practices in schools of when students are expelled. There are restrictions put on students that are impossible to meet. Oftentimes you see that. And so where at every single checkpoint of the decision with a student can we focus more holistically, learn about the student, double down on supports, and maybe make changes to systems that have been in place for a very long time that are built to push kids out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Britton, how do you want to close us out before we take a minute to have Dr. Chung come back with a final set of reflections and closing comments?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comments from Dr. Gonzales and Dr. Diehl, particularly given their really daily work with students. I think that as a society, thinking about, and this, part of this is around incarceration, but also, mental health and so many other pieces. How do we deal with persons who are in crisis? It's really clear that criminalizing people who are in crisis and in desperate circumstances doesn't work. So where do we go next? And how do we move and shift resources from, essentially, locking people up because they're in desperate and hard circumstances, to providing the people and the supports. And I think the point is really well taken, that this is labor intensive and it's expensive, but what are our other options?
I want to thank you all so much for such an amazing, what turned into a great discussion, certainly around the research that you're doing, but also the practitioner perspectives and work that's going on there. Dr. Chung, can you close us out in the last 3 minutes in terms of, I think there are a couple of announcements that we want to share with our participants before we let them go right at 4:30.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Tolani Britton and also our panelists, Dr. Diehl and Dr. Gonzales. You really inspired us to think more proactively instead of reactively. That's what I heard as a general theme, is that we're in a very reactive system that needs to be much more proactive and preventative. Thank you for provoking a lot of thought. And I'm sure that many of our panelists and those who will watch this recording in the future will feel the same. To our participants, we ask for you to provide your feedback to us as we continue to improve these webinars over the lifespan of 21 CSLA. And also, we have some additional resources for you if you're interested in digging into this topic more deeply. We also have many other events that are coming, including an event tomorrow with a book talk with Professor Susan Moore Johnson, who will be talking about how teachers thrive and when teachers thrive and how leaders can create the conditions for teachers to thrive. Finally, if you're interested in knowing more about our work or just being more connected to us, we encourage you to join us on social media or to join our newsletter, which will announce all of our activities, including other webinars in the future, as well as some of our other projects and professional learning. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. Please write something in the chat to our panelists and our scholar who took time out of their busy schedules to contribute to our learning. And have a good night.